Loyalty over competence. Why did Hitler elevate followers who appeared mediocre, hesitant, or poorly suited to leadership roles? To many observers, it was puzzling. Conventional wisdom suggests a rising leader should gather individuals of proven brilliance and skill. But Hitler deliberately inverted that expectation. He considered obedience more valuable than ability. Competence alone was not enough, especially if it came with independence. In his view, trust was measured not by a resume, but by how willing a man was to submit. This approach was a stark break from the norms surrounding him. German generals and civil servants of the time lived by the rules of rank, credentials, and tested ability. Their authority came through measurable accomplishment, military record, education, or bureaucratic training. Hitler disregarded those standards. He sought men who would adopt his words as commands and would never risk diluting his authority. To critics, his choices seem to confirm that his circle was an unstable band of weak characters. Yet weakness was also what guaranteed their loyalty, and that loyalty was what mattered most to him. Archival documents from the early years confirm how intentional this was. When organizers in Munich demonstrated real administrative ability, they were often treated with suspicion, not gratitude. Independent planning or initiative was regarded as disloyalty. Reports detail cases in which lawyers, teachers, and economists offered frameworks to help the movement operate more efficiently. Instead of elevating them, Hitler marginalized them. Independence, however constructive, was a liability. What he valued instead were men who deferred to his impulses, leaving the image of control firmly in his hands. The way he chose individuals highlights this pattern clearly. Hermann Goering, for instance, was welcomed because of his national prestige as a First World War ace. His reputation carried symbolic force, giving Hitler's cause a veneer of respectability and stirring public enthusiasm. Goering was not admired by Hitler for administrative expertise. Indeed, he was often indulgent and careless, but he stood as a glamorous ornament to the movement. He could enhance Hitler's image without competing for authority. In contrast, Heinrich Himmler had no glamour or battlefield fame. What he brought was studious diligence and absolute conformity. He absorbed tasks with near-obsessive focus, carrying them out exactly as Hitler demanded. Though lacking natural charisma or a decorated record, he presented no challenge to Hitler's leadership. Himmler's ascent into managing the SS was not due to brilliance, but to predictability. By embodying obedience, he proved reliable, and reliability meant survival inside Hitler's structure. Rudolf Hess embodied the same logic in another form. His loyalty was not cautious or strategic, it was consuming. Hess's attachment to Hitler bordered on dependence, and he derived his sense of purpose almost entirely from proximity to him. Though educated and articulate, he brought little practical skill to governing. Yet his need for affirmation made him useful because it ensured there would never be any rivalry. Hess highlights what Hitler appreciated most: devotion so complete it left no room for disobedience. Newly declassified memos reveal how this culture of obedience operated in practice. The rule was simple. Dissent could be voiced once, cautiously, but repeating an objection was dangerous. Disagreement marked a man as unreliable. Those who crossed the line risked being cast aside, losing position, and vanishing from influence. For men whose identity was bound to belonging in the movement, exclusion was a punishment more feared than open disgrace. The result was a silence that reinforced itself. Better to conceal doubts than to risk dismissal. Modern studies comparing Nazi appointees with traditional officials highlight how unusual this system was. Unlike the civil service that supplied bureaucrats deeply trained in administration, many of Hitler's choices had little or no comparable background. Their thread of commonality was loyalty, not skill. The absence of formal preparation would have disqualified them in most professional organizations. Yet for Hitler, these qualities mattered little. What counted was that they posed no threat to the concentration of authority in his hands. Martin Bormann exemplifies this thread even more. Early notes described him as bland and uninspiring, hardly a man destined for power. But it was precisely his predictability and quiet deference that secured his rise. Others, more talented but ambitious, were slowly moved aside. Over time, Bormann's unrelenting devotion opened the path for him to manage Hitler's private affairs and control access to him. His ascent illustrates the larger principle. Qualities dismissed as unimpressive could be transformed into assets if they guaranteed subservience. This choice of loyalty over competence did not mean Hitler was blind to usefulness. He retained figures like Goering for image, Himmler for administrative zeal, and Hess for personal devotion. He exploited the functions they could serve, but only under the condition that none of them stood independent of his will. Competence was tolerated only as long as it coexisted with unquestioned loyalty. If competence threatened to generate authority in its own right, it became too dangerous. To outsiders, this strategy appeared disastrous. Steering a party or a regime with second-rate administrators seemed bound to collapse. Observers mocked the Nazi leadership as amateurish and unstable, but the inefficiency outsiders ridiculed masked an internal logic. These very weaknesses held the system together. Every man knew his position depended not on personal talent, but on performance of loyalty. That knowledge created a constant drive to demonstrate loyalty, which meant affirming Hitler's place again and again. The consequences of this pattern were systemic. Decision-making shifted from reasoned debate toward ritualized displays of devotion. Meetings became less about solving problems and more about confirming allegiance. Competent voices willing to push alternatives were removed or kept at the margins. What grew in place of rational structure was an echo chamber. Obedience drowned out divergence. The circle became an arena where the act of supporting Hitler replaced the act of governing effectively. To maintain pressure, Hitler rarely gave instructions with clarity. Ambiguity encouraged competition. Followers fought to demonstrate closeness to his intent, frequently undercutting one another in pursuit of his favor. The outcome was disorganized administration, but also personal dependence. Men raced for recognition, not by producing results, but by proving alignment with him. Those who thrived, like Goering, Himmler, and Bormann, did so not on the basis of superior skill, but because they embodied pliancy in ways that reassured Hitler he could never be displaced. By shaping his leadership around loyalty, Hitler built a structure that sacrificed efficiency in exchange for total security of his rule. He was surrounded not by rivals, but by custodians of his authority, men whose mediocrity served to magnify his place at the center. This was not by accident. The disorder and incompetence of the Nazi circle were symptoms of a system designed to make power indivisible. In this context, weakness itself became the instrument that sustained dictatorial control. This reliance on pliant loyalty also prepared the ground for the next stage of his project. Once obedience was secured at the top, it needed to be manifested in action at the bottom. Harnessing violence and channeling the anger of society required more than speeches and party offices. It demanded a force that could bring obedience into the streets, turning restless veterans and young men into instruments of intimidation. The creation of that force would soon transform Hitler's movement from a political fringe into something far more dangerous. Building the Stormtroopers. After consolidating obedience within his inner circle, Hitler turned to a larger challenge, channeling restless men into a force that could project his movement's strength on the streets. The Treaty of Versailles had restricted the German army to just 100,000 men, leaving millions of veterans demobilized after years of combat. Munich, already overflowing with ex-soldiers, became a focal point for thousands who had military training but no pay and no role in society. Unemployment, poor prospects, and dislocation created a pool of men who knew violence intimately yet lacked direction. Hitler recognized this surplus not as a burden, but as an opportunity. While parliamentarians in Berlin debated constitutions, he offered these drifting soldiers something more immediate: discipline, comradeship, and purpose. Out of this, he built the Sturmabteilung, the SA, soon known as the Stormtroopers. The name itself was loaded with wartime memory, invoking the shock units of the First World War. To men stripped of honor, resuming uniforms and formations felt like recovering stature. Standing in formation, singing martial songs, and carrying banners transformed anonymity into identity. The earliest stages of SA recruitment were informal. Hitler and his associates approached veterans in beer halls, athletic clubs, and unemployed gatherings. Small incentives, uniforms, meals, or occasional allowances funded by sympathetic donors were enough to entice men starved of both recognition and opportunity. Even when wages were inconsistent, the promise of belonging appealed more than money. Becoming a stormtrooper meant no longer wandering aimlessly, but standing visibly as a protector of the movement and a defender of Germany's future. For men weary of parliamentary arguments, the SA offered something tangible. Orders replaced speeches, drills substituted for debates. Ranks, commands, and discipline reintroduced familiar rhythms. Civilian life often humiliated them. In the SA, their combat discipline was valued again. What had been social decay outside became martial routine inside. Even when resources were limited, the sense of regaining strength kept recruits loyal. Violence quickly became a mark of distinction. The SA was not built to attend rallies politely. It was designed to dominate public space. Street brawls with communists, pub fights with opponents, and disruptions of rival meetings established its role. These confrontations turned taverns and squares into battlefields where victories could be measured in bruises and expulsions rather than votes. For ex-soldiers, this provided familiarity. Fighting became proof that they still mattered. In a climate where parliamentary decrees felt irrelevant, these immediate clashes gave a sharper sense of purpose. Economic desperation fueled their numbers. Analyses show a strong link between unemployment among veterans and SA recruitment. The loss of a job often led directly to joining the ranks, where at least minimal provisions and restored dignity were offered. The Depression of 1929 deepened this appeal as countless unemployed youths poured in. Party recruitment exploited hard times, channeling despair into regimentation. The correlation was unmistakable. Where work disappeared, recruitment lists grew. Central to this expansion was Ernst Röhm, a former army officer who had long dreamed of constructing a powerful organization outside Versailles limits. Röhm's blunt, approachable manner resonated with disaffected veterans. He offered not just rhetoric but visible camaraderie, ensuring men felt recognized. Unlike Hitler, whose charisma played at a distance, Röhm knew recruits personally, marching with them and encouraging them. His drive and organizational ability accelerated the SA's growth throughout the 1920s. Under him, scattered groups became a paramilitary presence, shaping daily politics. The SA's tasks extended far beyond shielding Hitler's rallies. They embodied intimidation. Uniformed marches, banners, and rehearsed violence served both offensive and promotional functions. Each fight not only disrupted opponents, but also displayed vitality. Intimidation was inseparable from recruitment. Brawls acted as living advertisements. Spectators attracted to energy and strength often decided to enlist themselves. The cycle reinforced itself. Violence brought new members, and new members escalated the violence. Material support mattered too. Funds from industrialists and smaller patrons covered uniforms, printed propaganda, and modest stipends. In a period of severe inflation, offering food or housing stabilized loyalty. Recruits understood their survival was tied to the party. Political devotion became bound to daily sustenance. For hungry and unemployed men, the SA was not only an ideological choice, but a chance to endure. This reorganization gave Hitler more than a corps of fighters. It gave him leverage. Unregulated violence on the streets was redirected into deliberate, politically useful assaults. Instead of wandering chaos, SA units targeted rival organizations and enforced Nazi visibility at all gatherings. Order emerged out of disorder. Their disruptive force enhanced Hitler's stature, demonstrating that he alone could harness the veterans' fury into coordinated action. Every public confrontation reinforced the sense that he was indispensable. Contrary to appearances, the SA was never a spontaneous crowd. Its expansion was calculated, serving as both protection and propaganda. Hitler and Röhm knew that violence created spectacle. Outsiders saw disorder, but inside the movement, every clash was staged recruitment advertising. This strategic use of chaos proved decisive, bringing radicalized youth and embittered veterans into the fold. By the late 1920s, the SA had become the largest paramilitary formation in Germany. Its estimated hundreds of thousands of members were visible in brown uniforms at rallies across the country. Numbers alone did not define its importance. Its impact came from constant presence in public life. As Germany's fragile institutions faltered, the sight of uniformed marches signaled vitality. Even citizens skeptical of Nazi ideology noticed that no other party could equal their show of strength. Where opponents appeared vulnerable, the SA projected invincibility. Every confrontation carried double meaning. To enemies, it was warning. To recruits, it was invitation. The SA's message was simple. Politics was no longer about speeches, but about force. Recruits internalized this, seeing each fistfight or disrupted meeting as an act of belonging. Their daily struggles, poverty, humiliation, isolation, were replaced by shared purpose. Violence became not just a tactic, but an identity. This transformation mattered greatly to Hitler. The SA symbolized his ability to mobilize resentment into order. Drifting veterans were no longer idle troublemakers. They were shock troops loyal to him personally. Stormtroopers did not just guard events. They materialized in parades, clashes, and propaganda photos that carried Nazi presence into the public mind. Every bruise earned in a street fight, every ration provided by party funds, tightened their tie to Hitler. The SA's history reveals how carefully post-war anger was molded into discipline. It began as a small militia of ex-soldiers, marginalized by Versailles. It grew under Röhm's direction into a sprawling paramilitary network. Violence was not incidental, it was design. Recruitment, intimidation, and propaganda all merged in the brown-shirted ranks. For unemployed and disillusioned Germans, it replaced emptiness with identity and wove personal survival into political loyalty. Yet this story was not only about mass mobilization. Behind the smoke and marching columns lay another crucial part of Hitler's ascent: the ability to win support from groups almost opposite to unemployed veterans. Even as he paraded force in the streets, he courted elites who might have dismissed him as crude or uneducated. The tension between violent street fighters and cultivated intellectuals or wealthy patrons defined his unusual rise, and it began to shape the movement's next stage. Manipulating intellectuals and elites. Hitler faced a challenge when attempting to win over Germany's upper classes. His failed attempt at entry into art school, his lack of a university degree, and his resume of rejection marked him as unsuitable in the eyes of professors, writers, and aristocrats. Yet by the late 1920s, he had persuaded not only disillusioned veterans, but also a number of intellectuals, academics, and industrial magnates to lend him credibility and resources. His background should have excluded him from their favor. Instead, he used a style of manipulation that made supporters believe he recognized their value in a movement otherwise dominated by men of limited education. Many educated elites convinced themselves they were shaping him. In practice, it was the other way around. One of the clearest cases is Joseph Goebbels. Gifted with literary ambition, trained in the university, and yearning for recognition as a writer, Goebbels entered politics with sharper intellectual credentials than most of Hitler's early lieutenants. His insecurities made him vulnerable. At first, he doubted Hitler's importance and dismissed him as another radical voice. What shifted his judgment was not ideological alignment, but personal attention. Hitler singled him out as someone with unique insight, flattering him as if his talents surpassed those of ordinary followers. In a party populated with former soldiers and demagogues, Goebbels stood apart, and Hitler directed just enough praise to convince him that difference meant special importance. As a result, Goebbels transformed from skeptic to believer, and his contribution proved decisive. He brought methods of propaganda that professionalized what until then had been improvised slogans and gestures. He emphasized studying audiences rather than addressing them with one message. Campaigns were reshaped to meet the concerns of workers on the factory floor, shopkeepers facing bankruptcy, or students in universities. The party began producing slogans simple enough to spread quickly, repeated enough to stick, and segmented enough to draw in different social groups. Later, when the Nazis consolidated power, Goebbels' role expanded into a centralized propaganda system with firm control over newspapers, radio, and cultural life. His insecurity tied him to Hitler, but his work provided the party with tools that reached every level of German society. Hitler's approach to intellectuals like Goebbels followed a pattern. He identified men with ability, but who felt overlooked, then reframed their involvement with him as a form of validation. They believed he lifted them above mediocrity. The party became both platform and stage for their aspirations, ensuring that leaving him meant returning to obscurity. Intellectual labor flowed into the movement under the guise of partnership, but was anchored in dependency. The same method extended into another vital realm: money. Wealthy businessmen, financiers, and aristocrats were cautious about street radicals. Hitler seemed crude, his oratory unpolished, his movement unstable. Yet in private settings, his presentation changed. Gone were the shouted slogans. At closed dinners, he adopted a controlled, patient tone. To entrepreneurs, he acknowledged that slogans worked for the masses, but insisted that men of their caliber could appreciate his true vision. By appealing to their sense of distinction, he created the illusion that they had entered a privileged circle of advisors. They began to see him not as a reckless agitator, but as a resourceful man they could support and guide. Financial records confirm this strategy worked. Ledgers from the late 1920s show marked surges in donations following private dinners with Munich's elite. Within a short period of such gatherings, money entered party accounts that financed printing drives, equipment for rallies, and recruitment incentives. Analyses of these records show a pattern. Major propaganda campaigns often launched within 2 weeks of receiving large donations from industry leaders or aristocratic patrons. What appeared to be spontaneous rallies and surges in publicity were in fact aligned with carefully secured injections of capital. The misunderstanding between Hitler and his patrons defined their relationship. Many believed they had outmaneuvered him. Factory owners hoped he would suppress communism. Bankers assumed he would defend capitalist order while remaining dependent on their goodwill. Aristocrats believed they could enjoy his energy and discard him once stability returned. Some even wrote privately that he was a useful tool, not a lasting leader. Yet this assumption that they directed him was their miscalculation. In reality, their funds made possible the organization and propaganda structure that expanded his reach beyond Bavaria. They thought they had purchased security. In truth, they had funded a movement that no longer needed them once it reached national recognition. Social presentation played an important role in this process. Joseph Goebbels' wife, Magda, offered an image that reassured skeptical elites. Her refinement, poise, and elegance contrasted with the rougher street-level appearance of early Nazis. Pictured with her children, she projected stability, evoking the model of a respectable German family. Elite families anxious about supporting crude agitators were reassured by this display. It fed the impression that beneath uniforms and marches there was domestic normality. Hitler capitalized on this carefully, presenting the Goebbels household as a symbol of culture and order. These examples reveal the pattern repeating itself across different sectors. Educated writers and academics believed their theories lent direction to the movement. Goebbels saw his propaganda machine as elevating German culture under his interpretation. Industrialists believed their contributions purchased protection against the left. Aristocrats assumed their prestige gave them the ability to influence future direction. What united them was the sense that they were guiding a movement otherwise led by a man of meager education. In reality, Hitler let them think they were essential while steadily ensuring their role was subordinate to his authority. By the early 1930s, the practical consequences were visible. Party propaganda reached every corner of German life. Posters on factory walls, pamphlets for small business owners, broadcasts that echoed slogans across the country, student circles guided by repackaged frustration. None of this infrastructure had been secured by Hitler alone. It relied on intellectual work and financial supply from elites who believed themselves detached directors of events. Their combined involvement created the machines of persuasion that carried Hitler out of Bavaria and into national political relevance. By the time these elites reconsidered their role, it was too late to recover control. With the party's reach broadening, their money and names had already delivered credibility and structure. Once the Nazis expanded into a national force, dependence on their patronage diminished. Some former backers were drawn deeper into complicity, others quietly withdrew, but the resources they had already committed made withdrawal irrelevant. Hitler could choose to discard them, as he had done with earlier followers who outlived their usefulness. The pattern holds a certain irony. Intellectuals who believed their sophistication protected them were drawn in by flattery appealing to vanity. Elites who assumed money gave them control were reduced to instruments of his rise. At every level, he transformed the strengths of others into his own assets. By assigning them the illusion of guidance, he secured their efforts without ceding actual authority. This reshaping of relationships produced a deeper truth. Hitler's rise was not fueled solely by violence in the streets or speeches in beer halls. It was also enabled by writers who supplied arguments, artists who adjusted cultural images, donors who underwrote campaigns, and prominent families who helped erase stigma. What connected all of them was a shared misjudgment. They entered believing they could channel the energy of a demagogue for their benefit, only to realize too late that they were being absorbed into his system. By the time recognition came, the outcome was irreversible. Intellectual theories had been adjusted into propaganda lines. Business money had purchased printing presses and uniforms. Public images of respectable households had normalized radical politics. Every sector drawn into his orbit had done its work. Once those structures stood, personal regrets or attempts to pull back could not undo what had been built. Elites discovered they had given legitimacy, resources, and reach to a movement that did not need them anymore. Hitler's manipulation of intellectuals and elites demonstrates how deeply he relied on exploiting vulnerabilities of status and pride. Those who sought to guide him built his machinery. Those who hoped to use him as protection became the means of his independence. When his authority solidified, their illusions collapsed. But Hitler's success in bending them establishes another important point. His closest circle of lieutenants did not form spontaneously at his command. Behind visible figures like Goebbels or Himmler, less visible actors were also at work, ensuring he was supplied with loyal lieutenants and new allies. Understanding how these hidden recruiters operated is crucial to understanding how the system sustained itself.